My name is Vivek Bakshi. We recently hosted a webinar on protecting investments and assets and risk mitigation in the renewable energy sector. We received a number of follow-up questions that we were not able to tackle during the webinar. So we've asked our panel, as part of our new Dentons Plus series, to come back and provide their thoughts on the questions raised. As a reminder, your panel members are Rachel Howie, Gord, Tarnowsky, and Sean Stephenson in Canada, and Risteard de Paor in Madrid. So the first question we received relates to extension of time claims arising due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the question is, during the construction phase, has our team seen EOT-related costs due to COVID-19 shut down on renewable projects being dealt with under force majeure regimes in contracts, and are costs being passed on to investors or insurers?
So I'll take that one, Vivek. I think the first part of the question, so are COVID-related measures tantamount to a force majeure? And I think I'm going to start off with a lawyer answer because it's the appropriate one. It will depend on what the contract says. So if, for example, we're dealing with a contract that does not have a force majeure clause and the governing law is that of a common law jurisdiction like England, well, then you will have to look elsewhere to find your EOT or EOT cost-related entitlements that attach to force majeure. If there is no force majeure clause in the contract and the governing law is a civil law jurisdiction, well, then you will have a fallback, which is, in the case of Spain and France, the civil law code, which provides for force majeure. It's more likely that a forum contract will apply in this case. And so we're dealing with, for example, the FIDIC Silver Book, which is an EPC contract. And the Silver Book essentially says that there are a certain amount of criteria that characterize what a force majeure is. And then there is a non-exhaustive list of events that would qualify as force majeure. And the general feeling is, and it's certainly my experience, that COVID-related restrictions do qualify as a force majeure based on the criteria, but they might not fit into the non-exhaustive list of events. And what's the problem with that? Well, it's precisely in relation to the entitlement to EOT-related costs, because EOT itself can be given for a COVID-related force majeure event, but to recover your costs, it's necessary that COVID is characterized in the same way as war or hostilities, which is an uphill struggle. So it's really better to rely on other provisions, for example, subclause 13.7 in the Silver Book, which relates to change of law. So that does give an entitlement to costs. However, you need to really dig down and see what actually was the reason for the delay. So if the reason for the delay was a port closure, which meant that the boats couldn't travel to the offshore site, well, then that's a change of law and that gives an entitlement to costs. But if it's that your workers are simply ill, that's very serious, but it's not in relation to change of law, so you will not get your costs.
The next question we received was in relation to trends and what trends we're seeing in renewable energy disputes and generally in the litigation sector.
Sure, I'll jump in on that one. Substantively, we are seeing a greater number of situations where the issues faced by the investor are comprised of matters that could in some respects proceed through local courts or in other respects through international arbitration under an investment treaty. And it's an interesting situation. And when knowingly faced with this type of situation, or even for companies with international investment who are contemplating proceeding through only one avenue, it is important to get advice on what options exist and the available remedies and the implications of choosing to proceed in a particular fashion. In some situations, choosing to proceed through either domestic courts or international arbitration could preclude or substantially delay one's ability to proceed in the other forum. Where you do have a choice, then there are also then issues around timing to a decision or an award, how the procedures through to that point might vary, and if successful, what you would be awarded and the process for collecting or realizing on that award or decision. They can be very different between the two. So it is important to seek counsel early on to fully assess what options you have, because for some of these larger projects, you can end up in this jurisdictional debate on how or what to proceed with. Perhaps just a second trend that I'll touch on quickly is that we're in the middle of another flurry of our updates to arbitration rules and what I would call a more tailored approach by arbitral institutions. The ICC, ICDR, and LCIA have all recently updated their international arbitration rules. The IBA recently updated its rules on the taking of evidence, and ICSID is in the process of amending its rules. So a practical impact from these changes includes efforts to increase efficiency and transparency. That includes express provisions for virtual hearings and recognition of funding being a part of the industry. Also, as a practical impact, what worked in the past might not be the best copy-paste solution for the future in light of some of these changes.
I'll just agree with Rachel's comments and jump in on one of her comments about funding. I think the other trend we're seeing is the prevalence of litigation or dispute funding in these types of situations, where in particular you have state action that is involved. That type of state action can not only destroy the economics of a project, but it can also result in effectively depriving the owner or the operator of what is perhaps its sole or major source of revenue that it would otherwise rely upon to fund challenging the state action. So being aware and cognizant of the options that are available in the industry with respect to funding, I think is really important when you're embarking upon particularly that type of dispute. But in reality, the funding industry has expanded considerably, and funders are looking at purely commercial arbitrations. And it's a situation where whether you are challenged as an entity from a financial perspective, or whether you're a well-capitalized company, the reality can be that these types of disputes are timely or time consuming and very costly. So deploying capital with the use of a funder can provide considerable assistance in moving a dispute forward.
Thanks, Rachel and Gord. The next question we had is in relation to bilateral investment treaties and whether claims under BITs can be brought simply by sponsors, or whether there are other parties who may be involved in the project that might be able to take advantage of those treaty protections.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that, Vivek, on the basis of an award, a very interesting award that was issued in August of last year against Spain. So for the dismantling of the renewable energy subsidies in the country over the past decade. And it really opened the door to a new type of claimant in these claims, which is the project lender. And the basis upon which the tribunal decided that it had the jurisdiction to do this, it was under the Energy Charter Treaty, but there's no reason why it couldn't also happen under a BIT, was that the measures might not have been aimed at the finance, but ultimately they affected the financing because they affected the cash flow of the project, which affected the creditworthiness of the project, which in turn affected the value of the financing. And so the tribunal accepted that claim, which I think is a really interesting development.
I'd only add a couple of points. Every claim will be specific. So if you're looking at a claim, if you're a financier, if you're a financier, or if you're, for example, a shareholder, potentially claiming for reflective loss, which is also possible under BITs, you need to look at the treaty itself, how investments are defined to ensure that you have an investment that is applicable. Generally speaking, they're broadly defined in most investment treaties, but there are some carve-outs and exclusions depending on the specific treaty you're dealing with. And then also how investor is defined. Are there any limitations on the ability to make a claim? For example, shareholder claims in some treaties are carved out. You have to look at the specifics to ensure nationality, is correct. That dual nationality, for example, is excluded if you're a dual national. All these various aspects that that you need to really think through. In terms of structuring the claim, you're not only looking at structuring potentially for the entity itself, but also if you're potentially a financier or shareholders, different treaties can come into play in that regard.